Okay, let's jump into the poems. I only gave you one poem from William Stafford. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about a few of the poems from The Americans. Not the television show, which is pretty good, but this packet of poems. I'm going to talk about a couple different poems by Donald Hall. And I'll just tell you about my experience with poetry and how I came and became introduced to Donald Hall. I took an introduction to poetry course and to American poetry in high school, and that was when I read Donald Hall for the first time. Up to that point, my experience is probably pretty similar to yours, where I was like, poetry, okay, whatever, that's all like sort of high-minded stuff, no one understands, it's good for cocktail parties for people to sound smart and show off, but it doesn't really have a place in the real world, right? But Donald Hall is a very different type of poet, and he's at least a different type of poet than the poets I was exposed to. I live in Sioux City now. Technically it's a city, it's got 80,000 people maybe, I'm not really sure. But I grew up in a town of 900 people in the middle of Illinois. It was a small rural community, lots of farming, agriculture, all of those sorts of things. That was my experience. And so when I read the Donald Hall poems, he's from the northeast of New Hampshire, that sort of area. But agriculture is tied into his poems a lot. And he has a very intense relationship with the earth and with generations past and future. And so those were things that I could really wrap my head around. I was like, this guy is not, he's not an other. He's somebody that I can understand. And so that's why I wanted to show you guys some of his poems, because, this is a consortium of Iowa colleges, right? That's how you're taking this course online. It's like, we're a group of Iowa colleges. We probably have some exposure to agriculture and to living off of the land, or at least seeing fields all around us. So hopefully you'll be able to understand sort of the spirit of some of these poems. And we'll talk about the first one here, Maple Syrup. And we're going to talk about how images can sort of speak to each other. So I'll just read the first stanza, or part of the first stanza. Maple Syrup. August, goldenrod blowing. We walk into the graveyard to find my grandfather's grave. 10 years ago I came here last. So we have the words graveyard and grave. And what do you think about when you think of those things? If you had a picture, an image of a graveyard, what would it look like? I don't know if you can see any of my drawings. I'll give it a shot. But you probably, where's the glare? Maybe you can see something there. But I'm picturing all of the gravestones, right? We haven't used the word gravestone yet, but when I hear the word graveyard and grave, I think of the actual stones, right? That image is already populating in my head. We haven't used the word yet in the poem, but that idea is floating around. So if we go to the next page, we read at the top of the page, we're talking about being in the basement of the house, right? Because that's where they enter that, they're revisiting this area, they go through the graveyard, they enter the house, they go into the basement. Dirt floors and fieldstone walls, and above the walls, holding the hewn sills of the house, enormous granite foundation stones. So, in these 4 lines, we've used the word stone twice, right? And the word granite. And if I've already been introduced to the idea of a graveyard, stones is part of that image in my head, right? I'm already thinking of gravestones. Maybe I'm not thinking of the word stone, but when I'm thinking about what a graveyard looks like, that's in my head already. So now we've used the word stone twice in 4 lines, and we've used the word granite, right? Which is another type of stone. It's what I think of when I think of, if I had to pick a particular type of rock that's going to be in a graveyard, that's probably the one I'm thinking of. So even though he's actually talking about the construction of the house, the basement walls, those images of that area summon us back to the graveyard from the beginning of the poem, right? So even though this poem doesn't have rhyme, it doesn't have a rigid form like that, one of the things that's holding it together is the way that the images are speaking to each other, okay? So you can call this an image pattern or an image narrative, and they're sort of connecting. They've got this connective tissue. They're dropping sort of ideas back and forth. And I think it's probably a purposeful choice that he doesn't use the word gravestone in the first stanza, because then it becomes a little bit too heavy. But our minds are already making these sorts of connections, right? So I think that's really kind of cool. And I also like to think of like the geometry of the poem, what's actually going on. So what is he doing? What's the occasion of this poem, right? Well, 10 years ago I came here last. I didn't know you then. We walked among carved names that go with photographs, etc., etc. We pause at the new grave. Back at the house, we descend into the root cellar. So that's what's going on. So we spend some time above ground looking at all the graves, and then we go to the house, and we go into the basement. Well, what is a grave, right? It's basically the place where once you've been living above ground, they put you where? Under the ground, right? What is the speaker doing with this beloved that he's addressing? I didn't know you then, the person that he's speaking to. Well, they enter the house, but then what do they do once they're in the house? They go underground into the basement. So in a way, the speaker of the poem is enacting the same stories that have gone before him, right? And that's a theme that will come out in like all of these Donald Hall poems that you read. So previous generations, they live, they die, they're put underground. Donald Hall, though he's still living, is going underground to revisit the memory of his grandfather, right? So in a way, the geometry, if you want to call it that, the geometry of the poem is sort of echoed in places, right? So we even have the word descend used at the bottom of the first page. Then with a flashlight we descend frail steps to the root cellar. The bodies descend into the ground. So we have the living body descending into the basement, just like we've had dead bodies descending into their graves before. And so that's just a couple of ways in which the images are speaking to each other. They're not real subtle, they might not be things that you're picking up on, but our brains are pretty good at picking up patterns even if it's unconsciously. So I think that helps reassure us. Like we sort of get that the poem holds together well, and these are a couple of reasons why.